those who refused the drift, and then those who took the drift, the other player on the field, those who departed from the Bible and went with tradition. That really comes into focus in this first session here tonight. We're going to look at the rise of the Papacy. That is, how the Pope came to be, how the Roman Catholic Church emerged to become a full-blown entity, a major player, the major player, particularly in Europe. And when I say Europe, I'm talking about the mainland, I'm talking about the islands, I'm talking about Denmark and Sweden and those Scandinavian countries as well, even far into the east and ultimately into Russia. So we're going to look at how this group that departed from Scripture managed to seize control and basically dominate the landscape. There was a point here at about probably the beginning of the 12th century, maybe a little before that, when the Roman Catholic Church owned more than 50% of the real estate in all of Europe. I mean, they became extremely rich and became extremely powerful, and that, as I said, will be obvious. So it's important as we get into our study here to take your book and look at some of these factors that facilitated this. How could it be that from the time Constantine established the state church, which he just called the Roman Church, it was not called the Roman Catholic Church at that time, but it was understood to be Catholic in the sense that already certain theologians, drifting theologians, had become to think of and wrote about church with a capital C and not just church in the biblical sense with a little c, not churches. There really wasn't a full-fledged Catholic church till about 600. I'll give you why I think that, why I say that here before this lesson ends tonight. But between 323, when Constantine made that proclamation, and moving forward to particularly the 12th century, things really escalated, and gradually at first, but then with a greater momentum, kind of like a train going down a track. It just grew and got stronger the further things went. One of the reasons is Constantine himself, the man, the emperor, who became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire after he defeated three enemies, or three of his competitors who had each about a fourth of the Roman Empire. He stopped that. He consolidated the whole thing through war and brought them under his own leadership. Constantine saw Christianity as a tool by which he could dominate the landscape. Remember, as we've been saying as a part of review here, the Catholic or the government of Rome had tried to exterminate Christians, both those who were drifting as well as those who were staying true. They didn't see any difference really. They just saw them as Christians, and they had not been able to dominate and eradicate the Christians. So Constantine, being a fairly astute fella, realized if I could make them my tool, if I could give them the power of the state behind them, I could then control the church, and through the power of the church with the state behind it, I would be the boss. I would be the ruler, and we could reunite this Roman Empire. Really, Constantine had no intent of conversion. He didn't intend to become a Christian. He went through the motions. He said he had become a Christian, but there is no evidence in his life that he ever accepted Jesus Christ as his personal Savior. He was looking for a political arm up, and he got it in this union of church and state. So when he became sole ruler in 323, he immediately made Christianity the official or the preferred religion of the Roman Empire, and he expected that everybody would be a Christian in the sense that they were called a Christian, because now this is a Christian Rome, whereas before it was a pagan Rome. Now it's a Christian Rome. So therefore, whether you've trusted Christ or not, you're in the Roman Empire and you're a Christian. And because you're a Christian, you're under my authority, under my jurisdiction. And all those particularly the bishops, what we would call pastors, but by then there were bishops over several churches and then even monarchical bishops over regions. These people he saw as the leaders to bring the common people into subjection to whatever he, the Roman emperor, who was the head also now of the church, wanted. And he thought this main preacher, the one there in Rome, the pastor or the bishop of Rome, was sort of the head over all of the church because he, Constantine, saw it as a universal visible church. So he thought, if I tell the pastor or the bishop of Rome what I want, I've told all the churches, because he will make sure that the message gets around so that I can thus dominate the landscape. You know, not everybody went along with that. Praise God, they didn't. There were those Montanists, and there were those Donatists, and there were those Novatians, and there were these other groups whom I mentioned in the last session who didn't go along with that at all. But Constantine, by putting the authority of civil government, the authority of the state, behind the church, thus set the stage for the growth of this entity and the rise of what is called the papacy. Also, strong and charismatic pastors in Rome were very much a part of the reason this church grew, this false church grew. Even before Constantine, the pastors in the empire, many of the pastors in the Roman Empire, were aware of the Bishop of Rome and looked at him as sort of their head. And he began, whoever the he was at any given time, whoever the pastor was, and over the years their pastor would die, move out, and another would come on his scene. So when I talk of the Bishop of Rome, I'm talking of the person in charge at any given moment. Well, as this rolled along, these guys increasingly began to see themselves as in charge. They were bigger, stronger, better, more powerful, and they thought smarter than any of the other pastors, the other bishops that might be out there. And they insisted that these other bishops listen to them and that their word prevail. Now, that didn't go without contesting. Believe me, others stood up against them, but they seemed more and more, as time rolled along, to prevail. And so the big church in Rome did not view the smaller and other churches as churches. They viewed those now, and increasingly so, as a part of the one church, the Roman church, and its headquarters here in the capital city. Let me talk about some of these rulers. They're listed here in your book, and I'll talk about Anicetus to start, from 157 to 168. This is, of course, after Christ. We're talking now in the AD, not in the BC, as you all know. This man gained status of monarchical bishop. I've mentioned that. Now, this is before Constantine had declared the state church as he did in 323. We're back here prior. But here's this bishop of Rome, this pastor of Rome, who's already sort of feeling his strength and exercising his power. And so he becomes a monarchical bishop. That means he's over several churches. He's the authority. He's the ruling pastor. And there are under him others, and they're just called presbyters, or pastors with a little s. So the big church didn't view these little churches as certainly as important and as separate and autonomous congregations. And as you can see, the biblical concept, at least in this drifting group, has changed. They're not seeing the Bible idea of a church as a called out assembly of baptized believers covenanted together to keep the ordinances and to carry out the Great Commission. No, they're seeing the church as one body, and with the pastor of Rome as the man who's basically over all of the others. The next guy that I want to mention is Innocent. Now, I use that word tongue-in-cheek because he was anything but innocent. I tell you, he was a pretty bad guy. He's the first bishop of Rome to make the claim that Peter had a tradition and that he was in it. You know, I've mentioned to you that early on these fellows had the idea that the church was built on Simon Peter. They go to Matthew 16:18, where Jesus said, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." And they thought Jesus was saying, "Peter, you're a rock, and I'm going to build my church on you." So they believed Peter the first pope. He's the first pastor of the church in Rome. Well, there's no reason to believe that he was ever a pastor in Rome. To the contrary, the evidence shows that he was taken to Rome and killed, not as a pastor of a church. He's just taken to Rome and executed. And certainly, the talk of Jesus, the statement of Jesus, is not an indication that you are a rock and I'm building on you. Jesus said, you're just a little pebble and I'm the big rock and I'm building my church on me. But somehow they missed that. And this guy, Innocent, comes along, 402 to 417, and he says, Peter was our first pope. There's a tradition that all of the pastors of the church in Rome are from him. It's the Peterine tradition, and I'm in it. I'm the next guy in line, and therefore I have charge of things. And without proof or without evidence, really Innocent created a list of pastors of the church in Rome whom he claimed to have direct succession and authority from Simon Peter, and that's the Peterine tradition. You've probably heard that before. It's good to kind of know where it came from, and as you can see, it's good to see that these popes are now building a base. If they have to invent something to support their claim, they just do. I mean, there's no empirical evidence of a secession from Peter all the way to Innocent. But where there are these blanks, then this pope or this pastor, this bishop, Innocent, he just fills in somebody there. He just puts them in. Not because they're real, but it seems to make the case look good. Indicate a lot of people believe. What do they say about lies? You just repeat it often enough and people will begin to believe a lie is true. And we're seeing that in America, and we see that certainly in this case here. And certainly this is one of the big guns for the Catholics. It's their claim that all the popes are in the Peterine tradition, that they all have seceded from him, or seceded and come from him. Well, then that's, of course, a big reason why they say we have the blessing of God, because God speaks through Peter. When I speak, it's Peter speaking, and he's the man that God used. So I'm in this tradition. So they use that. And I want to talk about Leo the First, that is. There were more than one Leo along the line, but from 440 to 461, Leo cited scriptures to support his claim that he was in the line in the direct succession of Simon Peter. He really capitalized on what Innocent had already started. And on October the 10th, 451, in the Epistola Dogmatica, Leo's ruling on the issue of corruption and morality was read to the assembly at Chalcedon. And I want to just quote it. I think it's worthy of quoting here. Here's what Leo the First said. This is the faith of the fathers. That is the faith of the apostles. So we all believe. So the Orthodox believe. Remember, the Orthodox, not the Bible now, but what the church says. So the Orthodox believe, anathema to him who believes otherwise. Through Leo, Peter has thus spoken. So did Cyril teach. This is the true faith. Cyril's one of those fathers before, one of those writers that wrote along these very lines. And so you can see here that this man, Leo the First, is just simply saying, anathema to anybody who doesn't listen to us, because we have the power of God through Peter upon us. And if you're not here and accept us and what we say to be absolute, then anathema to you. You know what anathema means. It means to be accursed. He's cursing everybody who doesn't follow him. So Leo's position was clear. When he spoke, he said, Peter has spoken. And that's what all of the popes ever since then, or all of those leaders who eventually became popes, have said. The voice of the pastor of the church in Rome, you can see, was rising in primacy above the other churches. Not when a pastor of the church in Antioch or in Alexandria or in Corinth or in Jerusalem or anywhere else speaks, but when the bishop of the church in Rome speaks, we've heard from God. So he's now taking and seizing power. These charismatic men were doing that. I want to talk about Gregory the First, because I think Gregory the First is the first pope. The first real, this is when you can say there was a Catholic Church. It was in the making before, but it was not really a true full-blown entity until Gregory comes on the scene. Gregory the First was one of several pastors of the church in Rome who made political and military alliances with the new political powers that emerged on the Roman scene. The story of them is in part, I'm going to tell you a little bit later. Pepin the Short and some of these other rulers who were not a part of the old Roman Empire, but were Germanic men who came down from the north and from the west, or from the east. These men came down, and what this guy did, he reached out to them, and he began to make alliances as though he were the political authority as well as the church authority. The church, in that he thought himself the head over the whole thing, and many others now had accepted that and were acting on that in that way, or in that line. Now this guy comes along and he said, you know who I am? I'm the preacher, or I'm the pastor, or I'm the Bishop of Rome. And it's the head of the Christianity thing here, and it's major religion. And so I want to talk to you men who are wanting to take over here, and we need to work out an alliance. I'll work with you and won't fight you if you work with me. If you will do what I say, I will bring the people to you, and we won't have to have bloodshed here. So that's what this fellow did, this fellow Gregory the First. And I want to quote from Dr. Carl Deemer. He was one of my professors in Liberty Theological Seminary, and I think this is a very good statement, and I agree with it. To me, he said, this makes him justifiably the first pope, because he did that which, it seems to me, is essential to the core of the institution of the Roman Catholic papacy, that is, the union of church and state. Constantine had declared the church and state to be in union, but the church separate and under the state. He was not able to fully enforce that because there were these dissenters, and the idea was there, and he enforced it, but it hadn't become truly entrenched for a while. But it did become truly entrenched by the time of Gregory the First, because when Gregory came on the scene, the Roman rulers had become so weak, and there's reasons, and we'll talk about that, and this pastor, or this Bishop of Rome, had become so powerful that the Bishop of Rome was stronger in his church power and the political power that he wielded than were the political powers. So we had a true union of church and state by 600. And so I think this is when you could say there was a true pope and there was a true Roman Catholic Church. So it can be safely said that by this time the church had come into existence and had risen to great prestige and had risen to great power. Also, I will talk about the geographical position of Rome as being a factor why this church in Rome and the Bishop of Rome, the pastor of that church, became stronger. The position. I think it's obvious on the surface that one of the great reasons why Rome ultimately prevailed was her location. When Constantine declared the state and church as being wed together in 323, I've already told you that he was residing in Rome. That was the capital. All the Caesars, from Augustus in Jesus' day, and Caesar when he's back there, Julius Caesar, they had been in Rome. That's the capital city. And it's right in the middle, of Italy here, and a good deal to the north, and a good deal to the west, a good deal to the east of Europe. And so, it's central. It's the easiest place to be. And the Mediterranean's there, and they can get in their ships, and they can go to the North Africa or wherever they want to. So this is the capital city, and there's where Constantine ruled for a while. But there's also where this Bishop of Rome was. He was the pastor, the bishop of this big church, which had now had baby churches, and he's over them all, and there's a lot of others around, and they all consider him to be the chief. So this geographical position gave the ruler, the emperor, Constantine, the power to talk to and the ability to talk to the pastor of the church, or the bishop, who is over all the churches. So they become pretty tight. And so what the pastor does and what the emperor does, they're sort of melded together, and it becomes this central entity. And obviously, when all the other pastors realized that the Bishop of Rome has the ear of the emperor, who has the military power to enforce the laws, I mean, he's really up there. It's like Billy Graham has an ear of the president. He's pretty far up the line. Now, that's maybe not a fair comparison, but you understand how much prestige a guy has when he can walk into the emperor's office and he can get the ear of the emperor and talk to him and persuade him. This is the situation. The geographical location of Rome made a tremendous difference. Plus, that the Bishop of Rome, when controversies came up, and we're about to talk about some, it seemed like he had the winning side nearly every time. I mean, just time after again, the position taken on certain controversies, the position taken by the Bishop of Rome was the position that prevailed. And when it prevailed, it had the power of the state through the emperor behind it, and over and again, you see, therefore, the strength of the Roman church, the head church, the big one in the capital city. It's just growing in strength and growing in power. Now, I mentioned doctrinal controversies. So, by the way, while this little map is on the scene here in front of you, you can just see here that here's Rome. If I can get this little boy to work right here. See, here's Rome right over here, and here's most of Europe is up here, and here's over here Spain and England and over in this area. Of course, here's North Africa along here, and here's Eastern Europe over here and Asia Minor, as you can see. So, I mean, here's the central location, and you can just see the power of this geographical position. Now, let's talk about these doctrinal controversies here for a moment. And I want to go quickly through those. I don't want to confuse you, but it's just interesting to see what was happening, the differences in ideas. One's called the Arian controversy, A-R-I-A-N controversy, named after a fella or a man named Arius. He was in North Africa, down around Egypt, actually, in that Alexandria area. And this man very powerfully argued that Jesus was different and not equal with God the Father. He said Jesus was created. He was not eternal. He was a created being like an angel, or even like a man, perhaps, but more like an angel. I could help you who are in this listening audience understand that better. If you know anything about the Jehovah's Witnesses, you understand this is their position, very alive and well today. Jesus is not God, he is a God. Not the God, he's an a God. He's lesser than the real God. He's a created being. In fact, they say he was begotten of the Father, and that means, in their opinion, that he was procreated through a sexual arrangement of some sort, and therefore he's not the Father. He's an offspring of the Father. He's a God, but he's just a little God. This is what Arius argued early on here. And at the Council of Nicaea in 325, I mentioned that last night, the majority of those bishops or preachers who came to that particular council voted unanimously that Christ was, quote, the same substance, the same essence, co-eternal with the Father, distinct from the Father only in person, end of quote. I agree with that. That particular ruling by the majority went against Arius, but the Bishop of Rome was instrumental in bringing about the unanimous vote that Jesus was not lesser than God, that he was, in fact, deity. And because the Bishop of Rome was on the winning side and sort of the leader of the movement to bring about this vote, you can see that he gains clout. I mean, he's the champ. He won. And so he's strengthened. Another is the Nestorian controversy. The Nestorian controversy. This controversy was over how Jesus could be both fully God and fully man. It was also over whether or not Mary was the God-bearer, Theopticus as it's called. I mean, that's whether she was the God-bearer. You see how many of these controversies are over the Trinity? Over whether God was one or three, and how it could possibly be that there'd be a Trinity. A lot of these were big arguments over that. It was this case, certainly. In 451, Leo I, he was the Bishop of Rome at the time, he stated that, quote, Christ has two natures. without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. End of quote. This is generally known as the doctrine of the hypostatic union. I won't confuse you with a big theological term and labor there, but just know that it's an explanation of how Jesus Christ could be all God and still be born of a woman, and how he could have been conceived in a virgin birth. This was the explanation. Well, Leo formed the wording. They all agreed with him. The Bishop of Rome won again. And so all of a sudden his clout goes up, and it's just strengthening all the time. Then another controversy called the Pelagian controversy. Pelagius, a man, argued that men have freedom of choice and that they're responsible to God to make good decisions. Pelagius ignored, rejected original sin, and said sin is solely by choice. There's a certain element of truth there. Sin is by choice. You make a choice, you sin, but sin is in us. It's in our nature. It's in our bloodline, so to speak, because we inherited that from Adam. So sin came from one man, death by sin, but sin came through Adam, and we all are by nature children of wrath. That's what the Bible says. We're sinners by nature. So there is sin in a sort of double sense for us. There's sin in that we commit sins, but there is sin in that we are by nature sinners. And so when you put the two together, we have a choice in what we do and whether or not to sin, but we have no choice about our nature. We got sin into our nature, into our system. Whether we like it or not, we had no choice in that. This became the center of the argument of these men back then. Well, Augustine, who, as you know, is no real friend of the Bible, he argued for original sin and against man's free will, because Pelagius said you could live perfect all of your life. You know, if you were a little baby, you're not sinner by nature. You could just not sin, and you could just live forever. Well, Augustine turned around, he said, no, you couldn't. You have original sin, and it's in you, and it has to be dealt with, and therefore it is there, and you don't have a choice in it. Augustine went even much further than that. Now, I'll just summarize here to say what Augustine argued. He argued, look, you really don't have choice, period. He is really the first Calvinist. John Calvin picked up, well, he's not the first Calvinist. He's one of the early Calvinists, Augustine was. And what happened was, Calvin picked up on Augustine, who is the chief theologian in the Roman Catholic Church. If you know anything about that, you know Augustine's their big man. Well, Augustine argued against free will and the free nature of man. And he argued that you have initial sin, original sin, and I agree fully with him in that regard, and the Bible does. But the Bible doesn't agree that your sin is covered by baptism. And that's the situation, that's the solution Augustine came up with to the idea of original sin. And he said, if everybody is born with original sin, and you wash that sin away in the waters of baptism, then we surely must, as quickly as possible, baptize babies, because we have to deal with their original sin, and that's how we do it. And then later, they can have some choice about what they do and don't do, but they're either elect or they're non-elect. So we don't know which babies are elect babies, that is, determined before God to be saved, and those who are determined before God to go to hell. So we therefore will baptize all the babies, make sure we get all of them covered. So that's Augustine's solution to the Nestorian, or to the Pelagian controversy. Well, again, the Bishop of Rome and the position of the Bishop of Rome was on the winning side, and it strengthened the hand of the Roman Church. And then the iconoclastic controversy. Now, iconoclastic, we're accustomed to icons. You guys are, I'm looking in the faces of a bunch of computer geeks in here and people that are savvy to that. And you know what a landscape is. And you know that on your landscape you have all these little icons. And here's one that stands for Microsoft Word, and here's another one that stands for Microsoft Excel, and here's another that stands for whatever. And you realize that little icon is just a little indicator of something much bigger behind. Click here, and something else opens up. And in this something that opens up, you've got this program, and it's very intricate and has many things you can accomplish with this program. Well, icons came up, not the kind you have on your computer, but representatives came up here, and there was quite an argument, particularly between the East and the West. And I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but I will tell you, by the time of this controversy, the Roman Emperor Constantine had long before left Rome and moved his capital to Constantinople, over in the eastern part of the empire, over on the Aegean Sea, just a little north of Ephesus, up in that area. In fact, I will stop here and point out, this is sort of the dividing line of the East and the West. Over here, and over here the East. You see, this is Italy right here. There were powers, Germanic powers were moving down from up in here and were closing in on Rome. Constantine saw it, and following emperors realized this was happening and that we're going to get overrun here. It happened in 411, I believe it was, that Rome was actually overrun by these Germanic powers. Here's where the Bishop of Rome was. Here's where Constantine had his empire. But when he saw this coming, he moved his empire over here, kind of in this area, Aegean Sea, kind of on right along about in here would be where Constantinople is. And when he did, that created some major openings. So you have a division of the West and the East, because once he came over here, Constantine, and set up another empire, sort of the old Roman Empire with its head city, this became the eastern part, Eastern Orthodoxy, the Byzantine Empire, whereas there's a pope over here, there's a patriarch over here. And so now you have two wings of this Catholic move. It's not a Roman Catholic yet, but it becomes later a Roman Catholic over here and an Eastern Orthodox Catholic over here. And then they split. We'll talk a little about that when we get there. But here's where the sort of East and West division line is. And over here, there's one position on icons, and over here, there's another position on icons. And the West position was that an icon, a statue is not an icon. You know, they had to deal with the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not have any images and make any graven images. So the Roman Catholics, the Romans, I would say, not quite Catholics yet, became there. They said an image is really not an idol. It's just an icon, and it's not an idol. So an image of Moses, Michelangelo's image of Moses, which came along a little later, big old thing looking like Moses, it's really just an icon. It's not an idol. And whatever statues we have around here, and if you've ever been to the Vatican, you've got to see them. Boy, there are bunches of them over there. They said, these are really not idols at all. This is no violation of Exodus 20 and this first commandment. Well, over here on the east, they said, yes, it is. You guys are actually violating this Exodus 20 altogether, because if an image is greater than a picture, it's an icon. And as if you have a picture, that's just an icon. But if the picture has any engraving so that it sticks out and comes out beyond the face of the picture, it's now an idol. I would scratch my hair. I don't have enough. But, I mean, they were fighting over this. It became quite a war. Well, they actually never fully agreed, but the Bishop of Rome stood his ground, and they kept all of their images, and they kept those and didn't call themselves idol worshipers at all. So this is how this controversy went. So this East versus West thing was there, and it was widening the whole time. See, the move of the capital divided the state church of the empire into two camps. The West headquartered in Rome, and the East headquartered at Constantinople. And you know that's right about Istanbul today, so just so that you kind of get the bearings of modern time on this. The Eastern churches continue to find themselves under the control of the old Roman emperors. These over here, pretty well this side, they're under the control of the old Roman emperors. But over here on this western side, they found themselves increasingly under the power of the Bishop of Rome and not under the power of the old Roman Empire. What's happening is the old Roman Empire is shifting. You're looking at the same land, the same geography here, but a shift in politics, a shift in the political landscape. Some people think about the Roman Empire, the old Roman Empire, and the Caesars. And as we'll see in a minute, they'll look at a guy like Charlemagne. He was in 800. And they say he's the Holy Roman Emperor. But Charlemagne's not ruling over the same people that the Roman emperors were. What's happened here? He's not of the same strain. He's not of the same line. He's of a whole different group. Well, what happened is the politics changed. And a major reason why the politics changed here was that they changed the center of the empire from Rome over to Constantinople. And it became then a major division, and the west side grew stronger, and the east side continued to grow weaker. So that the west side eventually prevailed and just became the dominant player on the field. And so let me talk about this split for a minute. You'll see it in your notes here. Over the years, the dominating church in Rome succeeded in bringing multitudes of churches throughout the empire and the world under its leadership, its domination, its authority. And that dominating church is now called, at least by 600 and afterwards, could legitimately be called the Catholic Church, and is a split from the churches that practiced first century Christianity. I mean, this thing that grew, we're off that, don't go back. This thing that grew over there in Rome is a move. They say when Luther came along and Zwingli and some of these guys that we'll examine tomorrow, when they came along, they split from the Roman Catholic Church. And they started Lutheranism and Presbyterianism and those. They split, and they did. But let me tell you that the Roman Catholic Church split from the line of true churches. It's a definite split away from real first century Christianity. I mean, you can see what Jesus did and what they believed, but you can see how people begin to drift and get away from that, so that who left whom? Well, it's pretty easy to see that the drifters left the main line and a few stayed with the main line, and the drifters got strong enough to try to destroy the main line. That's really what happened, and we'll see that as it develops here tonight. Even though the state church had power, it had wealth, there were still those who believed in New Testament Christianity, first century New Testament Christianity. Their names varied over time, and when their doctrine and practices are examined, it becomes apparent that through the centuries, there were always those who practiced and embraced the doctrine and the practices of Jesus Christ and what's taught in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all the way to the Revelation, including the epistles of the Apostle Paul. Now let's talk about this new political landscape quickly. We'll get a map back up here. It's a very good map, and thanks to our dear friend here, Phil, for coming up with so many of these good maps and putting them in such good form. We're going to look at this new political landscape and the new political and military players as far back as the 2nd century. Now remember, we're already back past Constantine. We're back to the 2nd century here, and when the drift is just getting going, and these edification writings and these apologetic writings are beginning to flow out. I mean, this is when this is happening. All the way back there, the barbaric Teutonic peoples of Germanic origin began to move southward and eastward. So if I can just show you Germania up here, and you know this is today Germany and in kind of this area here, the Baltic states down in here, and we're looking at this Germany. Well, these people from in this area and even as far as over here, even back as far as that 2nd century, they're moving kind of this way. This is France down here and Spain down here. And the islands over here, Britannia, it's called back then. These people are growing, and they're warlike, and they're barbarians. I mean, they don't mind looting and killing, vandals. I mean, just destroying and burning people, raping women, killing men and women, and all that bad stuff. And they're just sitting right here basically at these two rivers, the Rhine and the Danube, and they're trying to get down here. These are the Alps right in here, the Alps mountains. And this is Italy, as you can see in here, and here's where the headquarters were, down here at Rome. And so they're pushing. They're wanting to take over. And the Roman emperor, who has the different ones who are still here before they moved over here to kind of this area over in here, over in here. They're wanting to resist because they can see the firepower. I mean, there's war at hand, and they know they're having trouble. They have armies stationed up here to try to contain these people back here. So they can see the handwriting on the wall, and they keep soldiers there to try to stop the migration and the influx of these people into their domain. This is one of the reasons that Constantine moved his capital. Constantine was smart enough to realize they're going to get here. I don't think we can hold them off. And I don't want them to come down here and defeat me and take over my empire, so I'm going to move it. Now, that may not look like very far on your map here, but I assure you, if you were traveling, especially by a little boat, or you were walking, riding a mule, that's a long way. So he moved over here where he thought he would be safe. You know, he would get out of the harm's way. Well, the marauding barbarians consisted of several groups, and here you may hear something about your heritage. I look around here and I see a good many white faces, and I see that we're immigrants, most of us, to this country from somewhere in Europe. And so some of these at least are our forefathers here. When I speak of the Vandals and the Franks and the Lombards and the Goths and the Visigoths and the Burgundies and the Anglo-Saxons. I happen to be Anglo-Saxon. I mean, when I look back at my family tree, I realize I came from this group of people here, these Anglo-Saxons. Now, most of the barbaric Teutonic people, and they're generally called Teutonic people, they had been converted to the brand of Christianity that believed that Jesus was a lesser God. In other words, all those people that I pointed to back there in Germania, not all of them, but most of them, Arius, who lost over the controversy, he didn't stop because he got defeated or the main line was against him, the Pope or the Bishop of Rome was against him. He went north and east and he began to preach. He began to preach about Jesus Christ, but preach that Jesus was a little God, not the God. So most of these barbaric people had converted, at least given lip sync to this new Christianity, this Arian brand of Christianity, what we could call here sort of a Jehovah's Witness today position on what Christianity is. Now, the Western style Christianity of the bishops of Rome was widely known as Nicene Christianity. Nicene, remember, they had a council in 325 at Nicaea, and they decided that Jesus Christ was God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Tertullian was one of those guys who had one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Well, that's the decision. That's called Nicene. At least that's part of the reason we call it Nicene Christianity. It accepts the deity of Jesus Christ. Most of the barbaric invaders were nominal in their belief of this Christianity. They were really just lost pagans. But they went under the umbrella of Arian Christianity. But they were not set on any religion. They were kind of ready to convert to Nicene Christianity. And the main reason they were ready to convert to Nicene Christianity is they had been watching across the river. They had spies. They got over there. They kind of knew how they were living in Rome, kind of punctiously, and those people were more affluent than they were, and they wanted some of that affluence. They wanted the wealth. And so they were ready to do whatever they had to do to become part of that new kind of lifestyle. It was the end thing for them, and they wanted it. So a 5th century Frankish king, whose name was Clovis, faced a critical battle And he vowed that he would become a Nicene Christian if he won. He's one of these guys and of these groups, a leader of one of these groups who are trying to conquer over here, these Franks. And so he's facing this battle, and he says, I tell you, it's what I'm going to do. I'm going to become a Nicene Christian if we win the battle. Well, he won the battle. So he said, okay, I'm now a Nicene Christian. And since already baptism had emerged as the way primarily to become a Nicene Christian, you got to get baptized in, and you're in it. He just lined his troops, his army up. This is, I think, crazy. But he lined his army aside a river. He got a Catholic priest to get up in a tree with a tree limb where the priest could reach down to the river water and wet the limb. And he marched his troops by. The Catholic priest did this. Now I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. He baptized the whole army. And so he had a co-converted Christian army right there. All of a sudden, just like that. I say that because that's an icon of how they did it. This is how so many of these people became Christians. They didn't know about Christ, death, burial, and resurrection, none of that stuff. They just knew they got baptized, and now I was somebody else, but now I'm a Christian. Well, these men, these bishops of Rome, they didn't just sort of make Christian armies. They did that. But they also, they converted their conquerors. This is one of the rare things in the history of the world, that you have a conquering army coming in. Instead of that army conquering the people they're trying to conquer, the people they're trying to conquer convert them and change them around. And this is what happened here. This just blows me away. Under the leadership of one called Alaric the Visigoths, took Rome in 410. I told you a while ago, they got there. It was not 411, it was 410, actually, as I see from my notes here. And rather than resist the new conquerors, these bishops of Rome promised to work with the new conquerors. So in exchange for their armies becoming Nicene Christians, converting to the brand of Roman Christian, what they would do, these bishops, they said, we will bring the people to you. They will follow us. Our people, they'll do whatever the Bishop of Rome says, because he's now begun to be really recognized. So we'll help you. We'll scratch your back. You scratch our back. And we'll avoid all that bloodshed here, and we'll just become one people. You've got to be thinking in your head, where's this elephant in the closet? Where is the emperor, the Roman emperor? Where's the Constantine, the next guy? Why don't the Roman emperors come in and stand up and not let this happen? The Roman emperors saw it coming and they fled. They set up their kingdom, their headquarters over there at Constantinople. They're way off. Here's the preacher who's now the power in Rome, the Bishop of Rome. He's the guy they're talking to. He's the guy that has the people around here with him. He's the guy they're going to negotiate with. They're not going to negotiate. They're not afraid of a Roman emperor who can't get to them and who can't resist them, and they know he can't do it. He's already run from them. And it reminds you of what you see in politics today. You get a weak president. You get a somebody who won't stand up. What are the Vandals, and what are the Visigoths, and what are the others think? Well, America's no problem. We don't have to worry about them. That's a little rabbit, and I shouldn't have chased it, but I just did. And so I'm just telling you what you see in history. I mean, you just look back here, and sure enough, here's the Roman emperor. He's a long way off, and he's real weak by now. He can't do anything, so who are they going to make a deal with? They're going to make a deal with the man at hand, and that man is the Bishop of Rome. So these new conquerors agreed and moved in as converts who were supported by the bishops of Rome. And now the church is kind of telling the state, the new developing political power, how it's going to be, and we're in charge here, and we're kind of working together because we're big guys here in this place. So let's talk about the state-church relationship as it flows at this particular time. In 751, Roman Bishop Zacharias deposed an unpopular Frankish king whose name was Selderic III, and he crowned another Frank to the happiness of the Frankish people. This new man, this new fella he installed and deposed the other, his name was Pepin. They called him the Short because he was a little short guy. And this recognition was a big honor for the Franks. The Franks had a big old military ruler, or a little old military ruler, I might say, with big words in Pepin, and all of a sudden, they got a king. We got King Pepin. That's a real feather in our cap. But what also happened to all the bystanders around through that area, they realized that this bishop of Rome has the power to make a king. Boy, he's big now. This guy's got some real power. And in return for being made king, Pepin, who had conquered the area, he gave the Papal States, the territory that is now called the Papal States, to the Pope, or to the Bishop of Rome. I think there's a slide. Is there a slide that shows those Papal States? It'd be kind of a fun thing to look at them. I believe there's one in this set here, fellas. Anyway, you will see Italy, the boot sticking down there. You know, it's kind of the leg with the boot sticking down. And on one side of it, the Papal States is a big hunk of land. I mean, it's prime land. I mean, it is really good stuff. So anyway, that's you'll see that slide maybe at some other point. Now, from that time, Pepin, of course, was the man in charge, and the alliance between the Franks, who the French kings. You saw France a while ago. This is where Pepin's ruling. You see why France became such a Catholic power, because now this is what's happening. The Pope of Italy has made this Frankish king down here in France. He's a king now, and so that sort of thing just went on along the way. Let me talk just briefly about monasticism. Monasticism is the practice of giving up worldly pleasures in order to focus on religious pursuits. Monasticism came into being for three main reasons. One, for missions. These Catholics were interested, or these people were interested in missions. Number two, for a lack of persecution against members of the state church. Now things had gotten easy. They had the backing of the church behind them. There was not that persecution that they had known. And number three, worldliness in the state church, because what had happened, it had gotten worse and worse and terribly corrupt, and we'll see that even more in the next session. Monasticism was an answer to corruption and ease and worldliness in the Catholic Church. And monasticism went through several stages that I don't have time to really get to here in any length. But let me just tell you, remember, aesthetic. It's not the same as aesthetic. We think of something aesthetic is beautiful. Ascetic means you do away with everything temporal and you just live a life of Spartanism and it's just really poor life, and deprive yourself of things. Well, it was carried out by the people, many of these people within the state church. So what some of these leaders, these Catholics did, they withdrew from that, and they went to caves, and they went to places in deserts, and they just hung out there and called themselves hermits. This is what a real hermit was, and this is where they started. But after a while, hermits kind of got together with other hermits, and they formed a little union, and they called it a monastery. You know, that's kind of how that monasticism got going here. In 529, a fellow named Benedict issued the rule for monks, and that's what they began to be called after a while, at least in a monastery. And what it basically said, when you go into a monastery, you agree to stay there till you die. And number two, you got to do what you're told to do, live by this rule that has been set down. Now, there are some political ramifications that I need to quickly run through of this state church. To better understand the practical impact of the state church union upon the day-to-day existence of the citizens of the empire, it's important to consider some of the laws that emerged out of this over the next few years. Number one was the exemption of the clergy from most public burdens. The clergy being the priests, the officers of the church, not only in local or in churches and wherever the Catholic churches were, these group churches were, but also the monks in the monasteries. So they were in the same category. State church priests, bishops, and other officials were exempt from military service. They didn't have to pay most taxes, and they were not involved with much labor or manual labor and low-type jobs or other public services. Also, number two, the enrichment and endowment of the state church. Over the years, churches were giving property and buildings, including those confiscated from pagans. The state began to take away buildings and property from some people, and they just gave it to the church. So the church began to get great money, great wealth. Also, the state church support of the clergy. They were paid by the church, and then the church itself figured out how to get more and more money from them. And the state church assumed legal jurisdiction over the people. Church tribunals, courts, now had the force of law. In spiritual matters, no appeal could be made. If there was a spiritual issue, and they made nearly everything a spiritual issue, you couldn't appeal. You just were under whatever they ruled for it to be. The judgments of the priest were regarded as the judgments of Christ. That's how they got it, boy. When Peter has spoken, God has spoken. And when the Pope speaks, he's speaking for Peter. And consequently, when the court rules, the church rules, it's the rule of God. So they put a holy spin, or what I call a holy halo, on top of this thing. And then the episcopal right of intercession, that is the right to intercede for criminals and rebels, became the right of the priests. So they could defend a crook. Somebody got out here and robbed somebody, raped somebody, did some bad thing. He could run to a priest, and the priest would say, hey, you got to back off. And the priest had the power of the state behind him. Then the right of asylum in churches. That is, somebody could rob your house, run into a church. You couldn't follow him in or do anything to him as long as he stayed in the church. They protected him inside there. And then the observance of Sunday and other church festivals was made obligatory. That is, you had to go to church, and if you didn't, you were penalized. You were given a fine. You had to pay a fine or maybe spend a little time in jail for it. Now, the consolidation of papal power, by 600, like I said, the Catholic Church had become mature. The papacy expanded greatly from the time of Gregory, who did this around 600. He was on the scene about 600, all the way to really about 1054, at which time the Eastern and the Western churches split. That division that I showed you a while ago, it became realized, so that you had then the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Catholic Church. And so here are some of the reasons why it happened. And I'm going to go quickly through this list. The new political and military players. Pepin the Short, 751, Pope Zacharias crowned him, made him king of the Franks, and after that the Pope is seen as having power to make kings. In return for the Pope's favor, Pepin gave Zacharias, the Pope, he gave him there's those papal states. I knew they were in here. Fellas, forgive me for getting ahead of myself, but I knew they were here somewhere. And so you can see this good-sized piece of property here that was given to him. There's quite a controversy over that later. Charlemagne, most of you have heard of him. On December the 25th, Christmas Day in 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as the great Holy Roman Emperor. But he's not ruling over the same political group that Julius Caesar or Constantine ruled over, because Constantine and that bunch have already gone, but the same geographical area. So now we have a Holy Roman Empire, which is not to be confused with the old Roman Empire. This is how I was explaining to you sort of how this came about. Then there are these forged documents, and I'll just mention two. One of them is the donation of Constantine. This showed up a long time later, several hundreds of years later. This document claimed that when Constantine moved his capital to Rome in 330, he granted the Bishop of Rome secular authority over Rome and its environs. That's what he said. A Catholic named Lorenzo Vela found that this was a fake document, but nevertheless, Pope Zacharias, who knew that the document was forged, hid it and hung on to his position. Just covered up the evidence that could have made life harder for him. And then another one of those documents that was forged is called the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. And this is a series of illegitimately forged church documents, laws, and creeds that were discovered to be false during the 18th century These documents appear to have been used by Zacharias to get the papal states. This is one of the reasons why Pepin gave him these papal states, some forged documents. So it's just a bunch of shenanigans, trickery and bad stuff going on. And then I could talk to you at length about feudalism. Feudalism is the absence of central authority all over Europe, which broke down into small independent feudal states or kingdoms, and each depended upon the strength of its own lord, of its own ruler, local ruler there, who was an absolute monarch over his own domain, which was called a fiefdom. Well, some lords placed parcels of their land in the hands of vassals in turn for help. I'm going to summarize this little part here to say that one of the things about feudalism is there were two classes of people primarily. There were the very, very poor and the very, very rich. Obviously, the Lord himself and his vassals, that is, those knights who went out in armor and conquered and were warriors, and the leudes. The leudes were his servants, the servants of the rich people who lived up here in the big castle, were separated from the peasants who just lived outside of the protection of the castle and fended for themselves. And they were considered nobodies. Their lives were worthless. And for a peasant, it was this caste system. There was no possible movement upward. If you were born a peasant, it was always a peasant. If you were in a royal family, you inherited property and you inherited authority and power. The only way for a peasant to move upward was through the church. If a peasant boy proved to be bright, like a Martin Luther or somebody, if they proved to be bright and got the ear of the bishop in that location, the bishop could bring him in and elevate him and even see that he maybe made it into Rome or he made it up the ladder. So you can see why so many of these peasants and these peasant boys, they wanted to buddy up to the bishop because that was their only hope. And just to give you an idea of how the aristocracy, the feudal lords felt about peasants, there's a sickening story about a certain German lord who loved to hunt. Most of them did, deer and other animals. It was a cold German night while they were on a hunting trip, and the lord felt like his feet were cold and his hands were cold and needed warming. So he had one of his military men kill a peasant, cut his stomach open so he could put his hands and feet in there and warm him. I'm talking about the brutality. I'm talking about the agony of what was going on at this period of time in this feudalistic systems. And almost all of the kings and all of the vassals and all of the rich people were Catholic people. They were under the power of the Pope. You say, well, why would they be under the power of the Pope? You got to understand, there was no German king. There was no English king. There was no French king. There's just the country's broken down, particularly after Charlemagne died. It just broke down 9th century, 10th century, 11th century into these few fiefdoms here. And as we're going to see, the Pope had a set of rules, a set of tools that he invented to control the people. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I do want to mention that he had what's called the excommunication. We'll talk about that. Gregory VIII issued a papal bull with an official proclamation by the Pope to proclaim the use of excommunication, the interdict, and the ban as tools to accomplish his goal of eliminating his opposition to gain the support of the secular powers, by force, I might say. And he instituted by papal bull, that's a papal writing, a papal rule, this excommunication. And the excommunication means that he could take away with excommunication the salvation of an individual. If you don't like what I'm doing and you give me grief, I'll damn you to hell. because he took the position, and the Catholics then began to take the position, and remember by this time they're in power. If we can give you salvation, and we do through baptism and the Lord's Supper, through the church, we can take your salvation away. So if you cross us, we'll take your salvation away. And we can not only take your salvation away, because Gregory II, he instituted also the interdict. And you'll see in your notes that an interdict is the idea we can not only take away the salvation of you personally, we can take away the salvation of your whole fiefdom. Or later, we can take away the salvation of all of England or of Germany. We can make everybody go to hell. And the ban was the third thing that he introduced. And the ban is the idea that if we take away your salvation and we ban your country, we can also run you out of your country and exile you to wherever we want to exile you. That was often used, as we're going to see later. Now let me explain what this did to the lords and to the knights and to the leudes and all of these people that were upper class. They realized that the Pope had the power over all of them, ultimately. The Pope could take away their salvation. The Pope could take away all of the salvation of everybody in their fiefdom. And the Pope also had enough clout and influence that he could bring other lords against them. And there were always wars between the lords. This kingdom and this little kingdom, that little kingdom. They were always fighting each other, border disputes and stuff like that. So if one of them got out of line with the Pope could get the neighbors around to gang up on him, and they could bring him into tow. So consequently, they wanted to get along with the Pope. So whatever he says is going to go. And especially they had the idea that we're not going to go to hell by crossing the Pope. Because he gives us salvation, he can take it away. We're going to please him. Can you imagine the domination? Now, I've deliberately passed over something here in your notes because we've just run past our time, and I'm apologizing for that. You ought to just study this section here that deals with the greed and financial exploitation of the church. The simony is called in the church. Annates, the first year's income. When a pope, and he got the power, he said, nobody can become a bishop unless I appoint him. Nobody can become an abbot over a monastery unless I appoint him. It's got to go through the Pope. And when I appoint you, your first year's income comes to the Pope. And some of these others, as you read the list, you'll see, he says, if you want to move to another, a better parish, a better area where you get more money, I got to approve it. And when you move over there, you've got to pay me your first year. Plus, the new guy coming into your place got to pay me his first year. So the Pope's in the business of moving him pretty quick. He does that. He's getting their money. And he says, by the way, if you want to stay where you are, I got a little rule, you got to pay for that too. You pay me enough and I'll just leave you there. But I'll put up for bids for you to maybe leave. When there's a parish comes open, especially a lucrative parish, you can put in a bid for it, but I'm going to sell it to the highest bidder who's going to have to give me his first year's pay. I mean, you talk about raking it in. You go to Rome and you see all those Persian rugs. You see all those statues. You just look around in there and see that St. Peter's Basilica. You need to understand how they paid for it. This is one of the ways that they paid for it. They insisted on tithing. Tithing. You notice that in your notes here. Tithing is not like God says, you're 10% to the church. Tithing was a real estate tax on any significant land and buildings and property in a bishopric. So if they had a nice building in there, they had to pay a tithe on that. They had to value it and send in money to the Pope. And one of the most ugly things that came out of this was dispensations. And this dispensations is the paying of the Pope money to excuse someone who had broken the rules. You love to go down the Rhine and see the castles? Wartburg Castle in Germany and the big nice castles in those mountains. Ask yourself, how did they get here? Why would they build one of those? That cost lots of money. When one of these rich lords would get out of tow with the Pope was going to take him down, so they would bargain, and he would say, look, I will do this for you, Pope. What is the charge? And the Pope would have him build a castle. That's not how all of them got there, but that's how a lot of them got there. Because it was I've done some sins, and I'm paying for my sins by building this castle here. And then indulgences. This gets bigger. It really was a torker from Martin Luther. Indulgences was, you can pay for your sins ahead of time. If you want to go out and cheat on your wife, if you want to go out and kill your neighbor, if you want to go out and rob somebody, that's really wrong. But if you will buy this document to cover your sins in advance, go out and do it and you're covered. No charge. It's a done deal. The sale of indulgences became one of the rawest, rottenest things that went on, and it torqued a bunch of people. It is the thing that is the catalyst for the Protestant Reformation, the sale of indulgences. By the way, jus spolorum was the idea that if you're a bishop and you accumulate property, your people want to give you property and die off and give you land and all of that stuff, that when you, the bishop, dies, all of your property goes to the Catholic Church. So like I said, before this thing was over, they owned over half of Europe. Well, I've already gone way too far, so let's take 10 minutes and let's go and get something to drink and rest a minute and come on back in, and I'll try my best to repent in the next session and shorten it a bit.